Yes, they can. Great. Let's go from there. All right. Good morning, everybody. Good morning. Good morning. Thank you for your flexibility with this choreography of the progressive lecture from across the campus, and thank you for your patience as we figured out the technology in this room, which we had not planned on being in today. But I'm so thrilled that you are all here. Those of you who normally are in this class with Professor Furtick, yes, I'm not Professor Furtick, but you'll hear from her very shortly. It's really my pleasure to welcome you today. I am Hannah Kostrin. I am the director of the Melton Center for Jewish Studies, and I'm going to actually get back over here so the people on Zoom can see. I just want to do a quick sound check, and the people who are tuning in on Zoom hear me all right. And just drop that in the chat if you cannot, and Lori will field that. So again, welcome. I'm Hannah Kostrin. I direct the Melton Center for Jewish Studies here at The Ohio State University, where we pursue the multidisciplinary study of all aspects of the Jewish experience. And it is really my great pleasure to welcome Professor Mika Ahuvia today from the University of Washington for her talk, God is Enslaved with Them, Exile, Diaspora, and the Jews in Late Antiquity. I do want to thank the Cummins Community Fund, which has made this program possible, and we continue to thank the Cummins for their generosity, for their support that makes our center run. Their support is so integral to our programming. And without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Professor Harriet Furtick in the Department of Classics, who we also thank for their support on this program, and she will introduce Professor Ahuvia and the event today.
Thank you all for being here today. Thank you to my wonderful students for sharing your space with all of our amazing guests. I'm really pleased to introduce Mika Ahuvia, who is an associate professor of classical Judaism and director of the Strom Center for Jewish Studies at the University of Washington in Seattle. She has published numerous book chapters and articles on Jewish social history, rabbinic literature, ancient ritual magic, and late antique archaeology, just to name a few of her areas of interest. She is the author of On My Right, Michael, On My Left, Gabriel, Angels in Ancient Jewish Culture, and co-editor of Placing Ancient Texts, the Rhetorical and Ritual Use of Space. It's a pleasure to have her with us today, so please help me to welcome Professor Ahuvia.
Oh, good morning. Thank you all so much for being here and trekking across campus and back. So I'm just going to start, as is the custom in Seattle, with a land acknowledgement. So I would like to acknowledge the land that the Ohio State University occupies and the ancestral and contemporary territory of the Shawnee, Potawatomi, Delaware, Miami, Peoria, Seneca, Wyandot, gosh, I should have practiced these out loud beforehand. Okay, Ojibwe, and many other indigenous peoples. And my apologies for not pronouncing their names correctly if I didn't. So the university resides on land ceded in 1795, Treaty of Greenville, and the forced removal of tribes through the Indian Removal Act of 1830. As a land grant institution, we want to honor the resiliency of these tribal nations and recognize the historical context that has continued to affect indigenous peoples of this land. So I also want to acknowledge that I'm speaking about a region that has had many names over the last 1,000 years. You've heard about the ancient Near East, probably the Levant, Israel, Palestine, Syria, Syro-Palestine, Judea, Canaan, to name just a few. Right, this was a territory of constantly changing borders amidst shifting empires, which displaced, enslaved, oppressed, and assimilated the inhabitants many times over. So the geographical terms that I use today are very meaningful to people, and choosing one over the other can feel very painful sometimes to listeners. And I just want to be clear that my intention isn't to make anybody feel erased ever in my teaching, or to ignore what's happening in this part of the world. The region of the Middle East that I'm speaking about is home to multiple peoples going through a really devastating, catastrophic war right now, and there's really overwhelming grief. But I still hope that academia can be a place where we can have really deep discussions and hold multiple truths and multiple stories and be anchored in evidence and really be in service to our students, our humanity, right, and the world. So with those ideals in mind, I'll finally jump in. Okay, so I am visiting a class today, right? So I was told this is a class on exile and displacement in the Greco-Roman period, so thank you for letting me take over. The research that I'm sharing with you was originally prompted by an invitation to contribute a chapter to the Oxford Handbook of Biblical Exile and Forced Migrations. And I specifically was asked to write about Jews in the Roman and Byzantine era. So I wrote that 2 years ago. Unfortunately, it's still under review, but that means that I really would value your feedback and your help in thinking about like what's most helpful, useful, and innovative about this talk. Now, what I hope to do for students in the class is to kind of share with you the standard paradigm. What's the paradigmatic story about Jews in diaspora and exile? What's missing from that story? And to give you an overview of, I guess, 3 important things. One is terminology, right? What terminology do we need to be aware of? What is the kind of a fuller history that has perhaps been missing in previous accounts? And what are the responses to exile produced in late antiquity? Can everybody hear me okay? Yeah, is it all right? All right, sort of. Okay, I'll try to speak more loudly. It is 7 a.m. on the West Coast, so, all right, let's see what I can do. Yeah, not a movable microphone. It's really unfortunate. Okay, so you have the overview. I'll keep coming back to this so you know where we are in the talk. Okay, so this is on your handout. You have this lovely quotation, I think that kind of encapsulates the way people think about the Jews. Jews have become the paradigmatic case for such key concepts as diaspora, whether by self-definition or within theories of diaspora more generally, and also a primary site for modeling social pathology. This is not a site of privilege. Okay, in other words, right, Jews are the sort of paradigmatic diasporic people. When people think about diaspora, they often start with research about the Jews, and then they talk about other diasporas, right? Whether the Armenian diaspora or the African diaspora or other diasporas. Where has this reputation come from? Like, why are Jews the paradigmatic diasporic people? So just a very kind of brief overview for those of you coming from outside of Jewish studies. Jews have a long history as the paradigmatic other. I would say the standard narrative is that their reputation as an exiled people began in the Roman Empire, right? Which you all learned about. I heard you've studied the Arch of Titus, so you know all this, right? That the Jews lost in their revolt against the Roman Empire. Never a good idea to revolt against Rome. The Jews tried it twice, and many of them were taken as slaves to Rome, right? They're paraded through the Arch of Titus, a whole series of coins, right? The Judea Capta coins commemorates the vanquishing of the Judean province, right? In gold and silver and bronze, right? That's the title slide comes from that. The inside of the Arch of Titus, right, depicts the looting of the Jerusalem temple, right? The menorah and all of the other sacred items taken from it to Rome, where they would be housed in the Temple of Peace, ironically. Okay, so, right, so I think most students will tell me that, the diaspora began after that Roman defeat and conquest in 70 CE. So, let's see. What's the difference between diaspora and exile? Again, the general scholarly paradigm, I think most people would accept, but those of you in this class will quibble with, and hopefully you can take this sentence apart. Only the loss of a political ethnic center and the feeling of uprootedness turns diaspora into exile. It is unique to the history of the Jewish people that this feeling has powerfully colored the emotions of the individual as well as the national consciousness. Is that on your, yeah, that's also on your handout in case you wanted to look at that. So from the Encyclopedia Judaica, pretty standard view, I would say. Actually, whenever I see the word unique in a scholarly account, I'm suspicious, right? All really good ideas tend to be shared. But I was thinking about this sentence a lot as I was working on my research. Like, does this hold true? So by the end of our presentation, I hope we can come to some consensus on that. Okay. So where, again, this global reputation after the Roman suppression of the first Judean revolt, And, hundreds of years later, you have the emergence of the Byzantine Empire. Augustine develops the doctrine of supersessionism, or the doctrine of the witness, right? This idea that the Jews are to be preserved, albeit in a state of subjection, so as to testify to their own wickedness and to Christian truth, until they finally accept Christ at the second coming. So Ross Shepard-Kramer has a wonderful book called The Mediterranean Diaspora, What Christianity Cost the Jews. And in it, she argues that most of in the 4th century, the Byzantine authorities basically started to eliminate Christian dissidents, right? All Christians that deviated from what was decided to be like the orthodoxy they're gone. Most of their sources don't survive. And they could have done the same thing to the Jews. It would have been pretty easy, but they chose not to, right? They chose not to because there was a theological reasons to keep them around as a subjected other. And the Christian Empire enacted a number of debilitating legislative moves to make sure that they would remain a debilitated other, right? Like prohibiting them from owning property, Christian slaves, prohibition of conversion. So this kind of cemented Jews as a exiled diasporic people. And you can see this is from an illuminated manuscript, right? You have the beautiful church personified with a crown, and the personification of the synagogue with a blindfold, right? Holding the tablets, right? The 10 Commandments, symbolic of the Old Testament, right? Like the blind Jews not seeing the light of the Christian glory. So this image is all over churches in medieval Europe. And again, is kind of a visual representation of this idea of supersessionism. And again, contributing to this idea of the diasporic other, we have also, right, the repeated expulsion of Jews in Europe. So each of the circles represents an expulsion of Jews from a city in medieval Europe between 1100 and 1800. Larger black circles represent multiple expulsions of Jews, right? So not only were Jews, you could say exiled in 70 CE, but they're repeatedly exiled over the course of these 700 years. And economists have shown that these expulsions tend to correlate with economic downturns. Okay, so every time there's an economic downturn, a drought, Jews are blamed and expelled, right? And it's an opportunity also, right, to take whatever goods they've accumulated. So that is how Jews became the paradigmatic other. Okay, so now that's the kind of the standard narrative I've just given you. And now I hope to not explode it a little bit, but to point out some of the problems and issues with this paradigmatic narrative. So first of all, let's talk about terminology. And I'll be really interested if in this class that you're in, you've also already discussed this and found this to be true. So modern scholars tend to distinguish between diaspora, right, and exile, right? So diaspora is considered usually voluntary, right? It goes back to the Septuagint, is where we first see it, right? This idea of voluntary dispersion. And then galut, right, is Hebrew for exile, usually understood as forced dispersion. Now, here's the problem. Ancient Greek and Latin and Hebrew sources actually don't tend to distinguish exile from voluntary departure. They don't distinguish exile from flight, escape, displacement. That is a totally modern distinction, which we should think about, like who does it serve to have this modern distinction? And we do not see it in ancient sources. Hope that is true for you. I certainly don't see it necessarily in the Hebrew and Aramaic sources that I look at. So there's already something wrong with the paradigm, right? This it's the loss of the political center that, changes diaspora to exile. Maybe that's not true if there isn't that ancient distinction. Furthermore, I think we talked about, right, diaspora and exile as a site of pathology, right? Like there's something wrong with the Jews for having been exiled so many times. But when we first see kind of discussions of exile in ancient sources, they're generally, a motif that characterizes individual founders especially, right? The foundation of cities is associated with exiles, right? So I have just a few examples, like Akkad, right, founded by Sargon, who himself is an exposed baby in a basket who goes down the Euphrates River. This might sound like a slightly familiar story, right? Thebes is founded by Cadmus, who was also exiled. Rome, right, in one of its foundation stories is that it's founded by Trojan refugees, right? So actually, stories of exile and flight are actually associated with heroic founders and heroic ideals too. So looking at the ancient sources and the way exile and flight is discussed should, again, like kind of destabilize how we think about it for the Jews. So that was like my little aside on terminology. Now, I think what's missing from the narratives of exile and antiquity is just like a fuller history of that, of the repeated exiles that Jews experienced before 70 CE, because I think those are equally important as the ones that came after. But also, what I'm adding to it is the reality of repeated enslavements, which I think is more important than has been recognized by scholars. So let's talk about that a little bit, and hopefully this feels familiar and not like an information dump. But let's just a kind of overview of Jewish history. 1000 BCE, right? The imagined golden age of ancient Israel, the age of the Davidic kingdom, right? This is a golden age that lasts for exactly 2 generations, right? David to Solomon. After Solomon's death, unfortunately, he has many children, and his kingdom divides, right? The beautiful united kingdom of David, right? That's the greatest expanse, of ancient Israel, whatever. It divides within 2 generations into the 10 tribes of the north and the 2 tribes of the south, right? So the 10 tribes collectively become called Israel. The 2 tribes of the south are Judah. Okay, and that's important because, as you can see in the 730s, the 720s, the Assyrian Empire is expanding, and they conquer those northern 10 tribes. And their policy is to deport local inhabitants into their own territories and enslave them, right? So here we have, right, the map, right, from here, right, from the north, they deport people into their territory and they settle their own people in that territory, right? So the story of the lost 10 tribes of ancient Israel goes back to this time period, right? Like the 720s to 730s BCE, that's where the origins of the myth of the lost 10 tribes of Israel. And amazingly, we have archaeological evidence, right, of these exiled because the ancient emperor Sennacherib decorated his palace, right, with depictions of his, right, exiling and deporting of peoples. Okay, so you can see, right, people being led out, captive Israelites playing the lyre, right? So you can see all these in the British Museum. If you get to visit there, come back to that. What's interesting, right, about the descriptions of the Assyrian exile, but also the later exiles that follow in the books of the Bible, is that the ancient Israelite storytellers, right, the ancient Jews, had a story, right? They had a narrative about why these things happened. And they didn't just happen because the Assyrians had a policy of deporting locals, right? As Yosef Yerushalmi put it, if Herodotus was the father of history, the father of meaning in history was the Jews. I love this book, Yosef Yerushalmi's Chlor. Chlor means remember, right? So what Yosef Yerushalmi argues is that, for Jews, history wasn't just like a series of wars and terrible things that happened. Everything happened because God wanted it to, right? It wasn't the Assyrians who deported the Israelites. It was God himself who was doing this. And if the 10 tribes were deported, it was because they had fallen out of favor with God, but that didn't mean that God's relationship with them was over, right? And that's why there's this myth of like the return of the 10 tribes, right? The 10 tribes aren't permanently lost in the ancient Jewish imagination. They're going to resurface and come back at some point, right? So some of you might know that in the 16th century, a Jewish merchant from Europe encountered the Ethiopian Jewish community and was like, oh, this is the lost tribe of Dan, right? So there is this like sense of like, someday when the Messiah comes, all of those tribes will be returned. So that's the Assyrian exile, but you've probably heard about the Babylonian exile? maybe? Some nods, a little bit. Okay, great. Let's talk about the Babylonian exile of 586. So remember that we had the remaining 2 tribes of the south in Judah. So they unfortunately decide to side with the Egyptians in a very ill-fated war, and that does not go well for them. The Jerusalem elite, the court, the musicians, all of the culture makers are deported to Babylonia. And interestingly, right, again, there's prophetic sources, biblical sources that help them make sense of why they've been exiled. So this is a really important key text in the history of exile, which is why I include it on your handout. So the prophet Jeremiah, right, from Jerusalem to the surviving elders among the exiles and to the priests and the prophets and all the other people that Nebuchadnezzar had carried into exile. This is what the Lord Almighty, the God of Israel, says to all those I carried into exile, right? So notice that, first of all, God is claiming credit for exiling these people. And what does he tell them to do in exile? Like to suffer, to give up, to feel punished? The opposite, right? God says, build houses, settle down, plant gardens, eat what they produced, marry and have sons and daughters, find wives for your sons and give your daughters in marriage so that they too may have sons and daughters. Increase in number there, do not decrease. Also seek the peace and prosperity of the city to which I have carried you into exile. Pray to the Lord for it, because if it prospers, you too will prosper. And amazingly, we have archaeological evidence that Jews did just that. So these are Akkadian tablets written in cuneiform on clay, and they are legal records of Jews that were in Babylonia that lived in a town, Elihudu, right? Like a Jew town, basically what it was called. And we have 3 generations of records of Jewish farmers in Babylonia, just living their lives. So I have always found that really fascinating. You all may know this very famous psalm, right, about the Babylonian exile by the rivers of Babylon. Right, there we sat and wept, there we wept when we remembered Zion. On the willows there we hung up our harps, for there our captors asked us for songs, and our tormentors asked for mirth, saying, sing us one of the songs of Zion. And there's this very famous line, if I forget you, O Jerusalem, right, may I forget my right hand, or may my right hand wither, right, it's difficult to translate. What I want to point out to you, right, notice that it says, by the rivers of Babylon, there we sat and wept, not here we sat and wept. So this psalm itself is already a memory of something in the past, right? This is already a memory of people who've apparently returned to Judea, right? Thinking about their exile there. So some Jews, of course, returned from the Babylonian exile, right? With the rise of the next empire, the Persian Empire. But some Jews remained. Some Jews remained there pretty consistently, apparently, for the next 1,000 years. Because we have a very successful Babylonian Jewish community that suddenly produces a great amount of evidence around 500 BCE, right? So it's very likely there was some stable community there all along, right? Some of them even claim to be descendants from that Davidic court itself that was exiled. We also have incantation bowls. I'll talk more about them later. So they're just clay bowls with a Hebrew and Aramaic incantation written on the inside. And again, they showed us that there was a continued Jewish presence, right, in modern day Iraq, ancient Babylonia, going back to that exile. Okay, so we've talked about the Babylonian exile. I want to talk to you about the Hellenistic Empire and its exile. You've all heard, hopefully, about Alexander the Great, right? And his galloping out of Macedonia into the ancient Near East. Interestingly, evidence suggests that some Jews enlisted in Alexander's army. I think when I was taught about this kind of great conquest, it was almost taught as like a bloodless event, right? As if like everybody just like saw Alexander and was like, sure, we'll join you. Like, we're not going to fight you. Like, there was no sense of like, actually, like imperial conquest tends to be very very catastrophic events for people, right? They don't, even if they surrender, many of them will go into captivity and slavery. And we have, right, so here's the map of Alexander's conquest, right, from Macedonia almost into India, right? Everywhere you see an A, right, is a major city that he founded, usually named after himself, right? Alexandria, right? The Egyptian Alexandria is probably the most famous. But yeah, all of these conquests did not happen without enslavement and displacement. And we have a really interesting record of that in the inscription of Moschus, son of Moskion. This happens to be our earliest inscription with the word Judaios in Greek. And what scholars think was that this person, this freedman, right, this is a manumission record. So perhaps his father or him were taken into captivity during Alexander's conquests, taken back to Greece, where eventually they're freed, right? In antiquity, usually slaves served a period of like 25 years or manumitted in their old age. So he's released and sets up a stele, right, commemorating it. So really, I think this is also our earliest evidence for Jews outside of the Levant from the ancient world. And he was clearly one of many, Moschus, son of Moskion, was one of many Jews that was displaced, because Philo tells us, right, Philo of Alexandria in the 1st century CE, that so populous were the Jews that no country could contain them. They dwell in many of the most prosperous countries in Europe and Asia, both in the islands and on the mainland. Now, he doesn't mention Africa because he's writing from Africa, right? So he's like, obviously. So Jews are in Africa, Europe, and Asia. And while they hold the holy city, right, Jerusalem, where stands the temple of their Most High to be their mother city, yet those which are theirs by inheritance from their fathers, grandfathers, and ancestors even farther back are in each case accounted by them to be their fatherland in which they were born and reared. Well, to some, they have come at the very time of their foundation as colonists, as a favor to the founders, right? So this means a very idyllic picture. Philo is trying to argue that Jews should have equal rights in Alexandria with the native Greeks and not, I guess, over the local Egyptian population, but with the Hellenized Greeks under the Roman Empire. It's a lovely picture, right? Did they come as colonists as a favor to the founders, or were they like just enslaved and eventually, right, like just became part of the population? But this quotation is really important to me because it also suggests that Jews had this sense of hybrid identity, right? That they had their kind of motherland on the one hand and their fatherland, or they considered, right, their identity, right, to go back to the Greek movement and conquest, even as they had this other identity in Judea. Okay, so we've talked about a lot of exiles, displacements. You have the sense that like Jews are already spread out in many places before the Roman era. Okay, that's what I'm trying to emphasize here. And now things get even more interesting. All right, so again, the Roman Empire begins expanding in the 1st century BCE, right? Takes over Greek territories. And once again, imperial expansion is not a bloodless event. And I think the artifact that best demonstrates that is this, this onyx, what do you call this? This like onyx gem. It's beautifully engraved on gems. You see here you have Augustus being crowned, sitting next to the personified city of Rome, right? He's Augustus, right? The emperor is surrounded by divinities, presenting himself as a divinity. At what cost? Amazingly, the artists show us the cost of empire and power on the bottom half of this gem. Do you see, this is soldiers erecting a war trophy, and you see they have bound people underneath, right? You have this bound man, right? It's two-sided. I couldn't figure, like, you know, this is so beautifully engraved that you can see it on both sides, right? So here, again, the war monument, right? These two people kind of looking sad and defeated, and this woman being pulled by her hair, right? It's actually like a pretty graphically violent image. The Romans are pretty honest about it, right? Like this brutality of conquest is the cost of this beauty, right? So like the amazing Colosseum, all the amazing temples that you see, right, in ancient Rome, slavery built them, right? Like that's the cost of it. So yeah, I think I think so often like when we teach Roman history, we focus on this, but we don't think about this, right? And who were those slaves, right? Where did they come from? So interestingly, you know, Cicero, believe you have read, right, in the first century BC is already seeing, right, the cost of empire, the cost of the corruption of the expansion of the powers of the emperor. And he writes about exile as an individual condition, but he applies it to himself, right? Cicero himself is exiled. He's on the wrong side of politics in his time. And he says that, you know, a statesman can be in exile in his own land, right? And an upright citizen of a corrupt state can be in exile. And in fact, he can carry the ideals, right, of the republic within him into exile. So right, he's writing this while he's in exile. He's still in Italy, right? He's not like Ovid. He hasn't been like sent to like the margins of the empire. And yet he feels that he is exiled because he has been, right, expelled from governing the republic. And I found this really fascinating that Cicero was thinking about this, right, in the 50s BCE, because if we go back to checking on the Jews, right, they have a brief period of independence from the Greek empires, starting in like 164 to like 67 BCE. But even so, some of the Jews in Judea at that time are so appalled by like the new leadership that has taken over, the Hasmonean dynasty, you know, the Hanukkah story, that whole thing, that whole period of like brief independence. Some Jews are so disgusted by those people claiming the priesthood for themselves, the kingship for themselves, that they withdraw into the desert. And they're like, you know what? Everybody over there in Jerusalem is corrupt. We are actually the pious and righteous one, and God and the angels are with us out here in the desert, in this community. So if you've heard of the Dead Sea Scrolls, right, that's this community in Qumran, in the Judean desert, they withdrew from society. I feel like they could have sympathized with Cicero, right? They're like, we're going to carry the ideals of the Jews, of the Jewish life out into the desert. So I think that's just a really interesting development, this idea of you could be in exile in your own land, not too far from the capital this time. Cicero, by the way, when he talked about Jews, had this to say: oh, those Jews and Syrians, themselves people born to be slaves. Why did he think that? That brief dynasty of independence, the Hasmonean dynasty, that very short-lived period of Judean independence ended with a queen, very wise. Shlomotion Alexandra was her name. She had 2 sons. She didn't want to give up the throne because she knew as soon as she did, her sons would fight over the throne. They do precisely that. One of them invites in the Romans, one invites in the Parthians, and you know how it ends. As soon as the Romans come in, they annex Judea and make it, right, a client state. But in the process, when Pompey the Great visits Judea, he visits the temple, but he also begins the first wave of enslavement of Jews and Syrians and takes them back to Rome. Right, so that is why apparently, like, Cicero's first encounter with Jews and Syrian was as slaves. And we actually know a couple of the slaves that were probably taken in these 3 waves of Roman enslavement of Judean. One of them was a secretary to Livia, right, the wife of the emperor. Her name was Acme. So we have a Jewish woman slave who was a scribe to Livia. And the other was, his descendants at least, were the ones that made this very famous inscription. This is the Theodotus inscription. It's located in the Israel Museum. So, oops, there we go. So this is what it says. Theodotus, a Vetinos, a priest and head of the synagogue, son of the head of the synagogue, who was also the son of the head of the synagogue, rebuilt the synagogue for the reading of the law and for the study of the commandments, as well as the hospice and the chambers and the bathing establishment for those who need them from abroad. It was founded by his fathers and the elders and Simonides. Okay, so what does this have to do with slavery? What is this name, Vetanos? If you guys recognize it, it's a Roman name, right? Why is he identifying himself by this Roman household name? So scholars think that this family or this person was likely taken to Rome, eventually manumitted, and they return to Judea where they found this temple. But the Roman custom is that you keep the name of the person who enslaved you, right? So that's what this family did. Theodotus, by the way, is like the Greek equivalent of Jonathan, right? Like God gave, right? So he identifies himself as part of this Latin family, right? He acknowledges like this history of ownership in Rome, but he's also a priest and a head of a synagogue. And he comes back from that. So I don't know, it's just like a very interesting detail that's usually left out. And this is such an important inscription, right? It shows us that there were synagogues that were already in existence while the temple was standing. So just keep that in mind. So that particular family returned to Judea. Other Jews remained in Rome, right? And so this is the cover of my book. So the descendants of those three waves of enslavement by the Romans, they inhabited a neighborhood in Rome just across the Tiber River. The poet Ovid shows us how much a part of the city the Jews became, right? He says, if you want to take your girlfriend on an interesting date, take her out on the Sabbath. The Jewish shops will be closed. She can't make you buy her anything. He also says, like, if you want to like show her a good time, take her like on the Sabbath to see what the Jews are doing in the synagogue. It's weird and fascinating and fun, right? So this was like out in the open, like it's part of, you can read the Art of Love if you're looking for some, kind of toxic masculine seduction techniques. That's the book for you. Okay, so that's the Jews in Rome in a nutshell. Okay, but I don't want to, again, like, going back, right, this is back to the territory that we talked about, right, the Jewish rebellion against Rome. Again, right, the expansion of the Roman Empire wasn't bloodless. It was not a good time for natives to be occupied by the Roman government. Jews rebel in 66 CE, right? I mentioned already the series of coin that's minted to celebrate the victory of the Romans over the Jews. And I wanted to just read you one inscription that we have. Claudia Astor, prisoner from Jerusalem. Tiberius Claudius Proculus, imperial freedman, took care. I ask you to make sure that no one cast down my inscription contrary to the law. She lived 25 years. So who is this Claudia Astor? Maybe her name was Esther, right? Claudia is probably the name of the person who owned her. Maybe he was also her enslaver, was her partner, right? Like that seems to be the case. And it was important enough to her identity that she was a prisoner from Jerusalem that it's included in her epitaph. Okay, so it's, for the most part, like the voices of these enslaved people that were taken to Rome, like do not survive. But I think this offers us like an interesting kind of glimpse of that life, a very short life. Okay, so now I've talked about terminology. I've given you kind of a fuller history of repeated enslavements, displacements, and exile. Let's talk about responses. Okay, and this will go quickly. I know, it's the 5 stages of grief. But I just, there was such a jumble of, there's so many responses in the Jewish sources that I wasn't really sure how to sort them. The 5 stages of grief model was developed by Elizabeth Kubler-Ross. She was a psychiatrist. She kind of came of age during World War II. She visited concentration camps. She was a pioneer in the hospice movement. And she developed this model of grief in a book called On Death and Dying in 1969. And I found it really useful to sort the many responses that we see in Jewish sources to catastrophe, enslavement, and exile. So, denial. I mentioned the rebellion of 70 CE, but of course there was another wave, right, of Jewish rebellions in 115 to 117, the so-called Diaspora revolts, and the Second Jewish War, right? The Second Jewish Revolt, led by a guy named Bar Kokhba. It just I've always wondered, like, what made the Jews think that they could revolt against Rome again? And the answer that made sense to me is based on the history that we saw, right, going back to the Babylonian exile, that exile was short-lived, right? It was about 70 years later, right? I forgot to mention, the letter to Jeremiah tells the Jews there, don't worry, in 70 years, God is going to come back to you. And Jeremiah's prophecy happens to be one of the few prophecies in the Bible that really come true, right? Through Cyrus and the Persian Empire, the Jews are allowed to return to Judea. So I wondered, when the Jews, right, lose the temple again in 70 CE, did they believe that maybe 70 years later or so, right, God would send them another redeemer that would kind of make history repeat itself? Was there sort of denial that this was a permanent condition? You know, possibly, right? We interestingly have letters of Bar Kokhba, right? And we have his own coin. So even as this guy Bar Kokhba rebels against the Roman Empire, he adopts their propaganda techniques, right? He depicts the temple. He depicts, right, this is the Jewish, the Sukkot, 4 species, right? The lulav and etrog. And he uses Paleo-Hebrew, right? Like linguistic nationalism to argue for the redemption, right? This is like year 1 of the rebellion against the Roman Empire. So I think that might be an example of denial. I also think the Mishnah is a really interesting text that assumes that like the rabbis are free citizens and that there's a functioning temple in Jerusalem. Like, to me, like that is a really fascinating like way of living in a world of denial. It's denying that you're out of power. There's a whole legal text about how to be a good Jew and follow the Bible. And yet the Jews don't have the power to enact those laws because they're not within their own homeland. So denial, I think, is one important response that we see in Jewish sources. Okay, let's talk about anger. This is one of my favorite sources. So this is written by the rabbis in the 3rd century, but strangely, it's attributed to a woman. Bilga is a daughter of the priests. And according to this story in the Tosefta, she is married to a Greek soldier, and she sees the plundering of the temple, and she stomps on the altar, and she yells at God, "Wolf, wolf, you consumed the offerings of Israel, and you did not stand up for them in their time of need." It's pretty angry. So it's what seems to be going on here is the rabbis have a criticism of God, but they don't want to voice it themselves. So they put it in the mouth of a woman, right, who herself is married to an outsider. But I think this is like kind of it's not so subtle. It's an explicit critique of God, but it's like they're not the ones saying it, right? They attribute it to somebody else. Okay, let's talk about depression. The Apocalypse of Baruch. Much more sedate response, right? Mourning everything that has been lost now that the temple is gone, right? An offering will not be given again from you in Zion. First fruits will not be offered. Wives do not pray to bear children, for the barren will rejoice no more. For the barren will rejoice more, right? So compare this, right, to what we saw in the letter of Jeremiah for the exile, right? Be fruitful and multiply. This is the opposite. Like, just stop it. Everything is pointless. The barren will rejoice. Don't bother to have children. Let's just let it all end, right? So this is a very depressed attitude. We do find some rabbis who also espouse this view, right? Advising against marriage and procreation, right? Until the seed of Abraham disappears on his own. That's also in Tosefta Sota, chapter 15. But the anonymous kind of rabbinic consensus is that you can't tell people to do that, right? So instead, this is kind of the more famous Jewish response to catastrophe and exile, right? This kind of negotiation. When you build your house, you apply plaster to it, you live a little bit undone in memory of Jerusalem. You prepare a feast, you withdraw a little in memory of Jerusalem, right? A woman adorns herself and you take off a little bit in memory of Jerusalem, right? Those of you that know Jewish life cycles, right? At weddings, you break a glass, right? Like acknowledging the destruction of Jerusalem. So that's a kind of negotiation, like you incorporate the memory of that destruction even as you affirm continuing life cycles. Okay, this is, I think, where I hope I have a chidush, right? And I promise I'm coming to the end soon. Minucius Felix was a Roman Christian apologist. And as an aside, he says, in the late 2nd, early 3rd century, that lonely and miserable nationality of the Jews worshipped one God, and one peculiar to itself. But they worshipped him openly, with temples, with altars, with victims, and with ceremonies. And he has so little force of power that he is enslaved with his own special nation to the Roman deities. Right, so this is a kind of a common belief, right? That if your people has been defeated, it's because your gods have also been defeated. But I thought it's such an interesting image, right? To evoke, right? This idea of a god enslaved with his own special nation. And it occurs to me that around the same time, in rabbinic literature, you have the saying, right? That the hosts of the Lord are the ministering angels. And you find that whenever Israel is enslaved, the Shekhina, as it were, is enslaved with them. This idea that, so the Shekhina is a new conception of God that arises around probably the 3rd century CE. It's a feminine aspect of God is usually how it's described. It's like the feminine presence of God on earth. But I'm looking at this, and I'd love to hear from you if you find this convincing. Like, I feel like I can't, of course, prove an actual conversation, but I feel like these ideas and these images have to be in dialogue with each other. You have this, right, this coin series, right, that's everywhere. How did Jews interpret that image, right? We know how the Romans interpreted that image, right? This is the personification of the defeated, enslaved province of Judea, right? It says Judea on there. But when Jews looked at it, did they say, yeah, that's our enslaved country? Or did they say, yeah, this is our God enslaved, but that God is enslaved with us. And then you also have the feminine, right? It's a feminine Shekhina that's enslaved with the Jews, right? So this is common, right, for people who are oppressed to turn something that's been used against them into something positive and empowering. And I think that's what is happening here. All right, so this becomes very common, right? We have this, the Shekhina becomes very common, I should say, in Jewish prayer. There's this invocation of angels on all sides. That's now part of the standard Jewish liturgy. In the name of the Lord, the God of Israel, right? This is my book, right? On my right is Michael, on my left is Gabriel. In front of me is Uriel, behind me is Raphael, and above my head is the Shekhina of God. Now, before this enters the fixed liturgy, this is actually all over incantation bowls in Jewish Aramaic. And actually there's been fascinating research that this invocation of angels on all sides is actually in multiple languages. It's not just in Jewish Aramaic, it's in Arabic, it's in Persian, because it's such a beautiful idea. And even though there's a lot of variation in the angels that are invoked, right? I mentioned the incantation bowls. Our earliest version of this invocation is actually from these incantation bowls in Babylonia, and they're primarily written from like the 4th to 8th century CE, only in Babylonia. So it appears to me, right, that we can say that this language was in the ritual world probably first, right? This idea of the Shekhina, right, the feminine personification of God is with the individual, right, protecting them from whatever it is that is troubling them. And eventually, right, it goes from the ritual magic world. It's so popular that, it has to become part of the Jewish liturgy, and now it's part of the nighttime prayer. When I wrote my book, I was really obsessed of trying to find a source for this idea within the rabbis. I don't think it's that important anymore, but I did just want to point out that the rabbis, there is this tradition that talks about being surrounded by the presence of God, but the rabbis usually picture it as clouds, right? Like being surrounded by clouds on four sides and above and below, but I don't know that it's that necessary, but it's kind of an interesting idea. So this idea that God is with the Jews, this is of course a part of a long exegesis of the Exodus narrative, right? So in Exodus, right, God is of course with the liberated people of Israel, or he's liberating them. But in late antiquity, following the series of catastrophic wars and defeats that the Jews experience, right, the image has to change to God enslaved, or in exile with the Jews. So finally, right, acceptance, right? How do we see acceptance of exile and defeat in Jewish sources? I have this, I think on your handout, right? You have on the back page this adaptation of Psalm 137. I've already mentioned the angels, right? So what I see happening in this adaptation for the Targum is a translation, right, from Hebrew into Aramaic that was spoken in this and recited in the synagogues. So you have every translation, right, is creative, right? It's an adaptation. It adds, it's an expansion, I guess you could say. So if we look at this more closely, instead of saying there our captors, right, took us, it says there the Babylonians took us. Babylonia becomes code word for Rome in late antiquity. They asked us to say words of songs. Our plunderers for fun said, give praise for us from the songs you used to say in Zion. That was a really interesting addition. Immediately the Levites bit off, right, mutilated their thumbs with their teeth, saying, how can we praise the Lord on profane land? What the translators seem to be doing here is insisting that, like, not just these singers refused to sing, they actually made themselves ritually incapable of singing pious songs. They're like, it's encouraging people to just be completely defiant of whatever their captors ask of them. And then instead of, the singer saying, right, if I forget you, O Jerusalem, let my right hand wither, it's the voice of the Holy Spirit saying, if I forget you, may my right hand wither, right? So God himself, right, is in exile with the singers. And then you have the addition of the Michael, Prince of Jerusalem, right, and Gabriel, the Prince of Zion. So you have there's an increase in imagery of the presence of God and the angels with the Israelites. So I can't even read the ending of the psalm. I find it so devastating and troubling. So I'll just say that revenge fantasies are part of dealing with catastrophe and exile. And I'm sure you can see that today. And I'll just end with some images. This is a synagogue, Hamat Tiberias, right? So it's by the Sea of Galilee. And I'll be discussing it later this afternoon for those of you who will be around. But what we see in this nave, right? We know the person who commissioned it. His name is Severus. There's evidence that he actually himself was a foster child of an elite family in Judea, perhaps even enslaved. So it's important to remember that Jews are they are put into slavery, but they also enslave others. This was common in the Mediterranean world. But he says that he commissioned this mosaic. And right, what do we see in this mosaic? You have a beautiful zodiac. Right, you have imagery of the Jerusalem temple, the menorah. You have a request for blessings on the founders of the synagogue. So, Jews don't just become depressed and stop creating in late antiquity, right? They make sense of what's happened to them, right? And this evocation, right, of the zodiac seems to suggest there's a plan for all this, right? It is in the stars. Interestingly, in the ancient world, enslavement was seen as something that would happen to you because of fate or, your mazal, your sign. It wasn't because there was something inherently wrong with you. It wasn't a racialized thing. It was just destiny, fate, providence. But there's clear sense of hope for restoration as well. Very recently, another synagogue mosaic was excavated in the north in Hukok. scholars are still trying to make sense of it, right? Because the standard story is like, oh yeah, Jews accepted exile and, were never militant again after the second Jewish revolt. But this mosaic has lots of biblical scenes from the book of Judges, which show, this is Samson raising the gates of Gaza. There's a lot of violent imagery in the floors of the synagogue mosaic. So like on one side you have depiction of Samson. He's also like, tying torches to the fox's tails. On the other side, you have the Yael assassinating Sisera, right? And the prophetess Deborah. So you have these these scenes of violent engagement and revenge with the other. And then there's like this mysterious scene, which why didn't they put captions? It's the first kind of non-biblical scene that we've discovered in a synagogue mosaic. Some say it depicts the encounter with Alexander the Great. Some people think it has to do with the Maccabees, but some sort of peace agreement with the Greek generals, right? You have elephants. It's our first time seeing elephants in a mosaic. You have these arches, right? And the old man, and yeah, it's hard to make sense of, but there's something a more complex negotiation with foreign powers than has been previously assumed. So, okay, let's kind of try to bring together all these many different things I've discussed. We've talked about how exile was a heroic condition, right, in ancient Mesopotamian and Greek sources. Cicero talks about the idea of a statesman being in exile in his own land. In Jewish texts, I think we see this innovative idea of God being enslaved and in exile with the Jews. Perhaps, again, in response to Roman imagery, I would argue. Fascinatingly, John Chrysostom, Christian theologian, will write in the 5th century that all Christians are in exile, right? So even as, the Christians are persecuting, the heck out of each other, John Chrysostom finds himself on the wrong side of Christian orthodoxy and himself has to go into exile, right? And suddenly he's like, actually, all Christians are in exile. To my mind, he's definitely appropriating a Jewish idea, because this is the thing. No good idea can remain with one people. All good ideas tend to be adopted by other people and adapted to suit their own needs. So it's possible that the Jews adopted, right, some of the ideas that were current, right, in the Mesopotamian and Greco-Roman world. They're certainly impacted by Greco-Roman conquest and enslavement and exile. But they also, in turn, might have innovated ideas that were then adopted by Christians in turn. So it's a much more complex conversation. So here's what I hope your takeaways are, and I hope we have a minute for questions. Again, no distinction between forced exile, flight, and antiquity. Exile was part of Jewish self-understanding before 70 CE. Repeated enslavement was a feature of Jewish exile, even as manumitted persons, right? We talked about Theodotus, mentioned Severus, contributed to Jewish society and culture. And there was a really rich late antique conversation about exile, right? You could be in exile in your ancestral homeland. You could have both individual and communal conceptions of exile. Maybe that started with the Jews, but it certainly wasn't limited to the Jews because, Christians adopted it. And finally, right, God and the angels, right, this emphasis on being in community with the divine was what helped what helped the ancient Jews make sense of their experience. So thank you for your attention. Sorry, it was a bit longer than I expected. Thanks.
Thank you so much. We have time for a couple of questions.
I just was curious, how come you didn't mention anything about the Jews when they were enslaved by the Egyptians, especially the story of Moses, because it has tons of elements. God, the final thing that God sends is the angel of death to kill the firstborn child, which is kind of mentioned here at the final line of the passage, along with the Jews being exiled from their homeland by God because they worship a golden cow. That takes them into the desert for 50 years, I believe, or something.
Close, right? The golden calf happens on the way out of Egypt.
Yeah, the way out of Egypt.
Right, they had been out, right, for a long time beforehand.
They're not allowed to go to Israel or, to their kingdom because of it for I think it's 50 years, I'm not 100% sure.
40, yeah.
and how come you didn't mention it?
So those are really important biblical stories that are foundational to Jewish identity, but I was kind of trying to do a historical overview. Yeah, if I had longer time, I absolutely would have talked more about the Exodus story. So thanks for bringing that into the conversation. Yeah, are there questions? I didn't talk about Josephus. Aren't you upset about that? Yeah. Yeah.
We were looking at this part where he talks about how the destruction of Jerusalem is a divine plan. You know, you see we talked about all these efforts, different Romans saying, oh, maybe we don't have to destroy it. Maybe we should do this. And he said, it doesn't matter. It was all going down. And we talked about the connection with traditions of Greek historiography, or the way that everything's a world historical conflict. That's why I'm writing this history, is because this is the most important thing that ever happened. But it seems like there's also potentially a Jewish context for the way he's framing that as well. So I'm curious how you see Greek and Jewish influences playing into the divine plan of destruction in Josephus' narrative. Yeah, Josephus himself says he studied with the Sadducees and the Pharisees and the Essenes out in the desert. He was like, I studied all the things. I've chosen to be a Pharisee. So he's well versed in these ideas of like everything happening because God willed it so. So he's very much in keeping with those ideas. And he actually says, do you guys hopefully read this passage, that as the temple is being destroyed, he hears the voices of God and the angels leaving the temple, right? So very much the idea that God is in the temple, right, with the Jews and with the priests. Sorry, you have a question?
Yeah. I read a paper recently, I think it was by Ed Greenstein, who says that there's like a narrative template where a hero will go into exile as a staging ground, come back and reconquer a territory.
Yeah.
So does that continue into late antiquity, that kind of
the hero story? The hero motif? I don't think so, because that story doesn't serve the Jews anymore. Right, but it's a very powerful story, right? That you go into another space to develop, and then you come back. But I mean, I guess you could say that the Jews keep retelling that story because they retell the story of Jacob, right? The story of Abraham wandering from to the promised land, or Joseph going down into Egypt, right? Those are all stories of like heroes in exile, self-actualizing. Thanks. Yeah. I think we have another minute, yeah. Mm-hmm. No, it's you. Go ahead.
You talked about, how different Jews had like different interpretations of what happened, and how they had different levels of grief in terms of how they accepted the fall of their kingdom and of their holy temple.
Yeah.
Was there like a generalized idea? Because it seems like not all the Jews were like angry or depressed, because they seem to also migrate to all around Europe.
Exactly.
So eventually going back to Jerusalem.
That's right. Yeah, there are diverse responses, right? So going back to the Babylonian exile, at least, right, from that moment on, you have decentralized Jewish communities over 3 continents, right? Or at least 2 and then 3, right? So, of course, there were myriad responses. Maybe to some Jews, the destruction of Jerusalem it didn't really impact their life, except symbolically, right? They already had synagogues, like they could have continued going to those synagogues. But maybe the reputation of Jews, right, as like rebellious people in the Roman Empire, that might have made their lives tough, right? Which is why you probably have the diaspora revolts. But it's really important to remember that there was always like there wasn't like a central leadership of the Jews. So many different responses survive. And thanks for bringing us back to that, because that's kind of what I hope that your takeaway is. This is a rich conversation. So thank you so much. I know you have to run to another class, right? Yeah, okay. I appreciate your attention, and email me if you have follow-up questions.
Thank you.